Hi, everyone. This is a quick screencast to help you with the trial of John Adams. I'm going to try to make a couple of these, and there's already a lot of resources available for you on the website, PowerPoints, voice threads, etc. So real quick, I want to go through the witnesses and very quickly give you some insight onto how each witness can help with your case. So let's start with the defense. So John Adams is pretty obvious. John Adams is the defendant, and the defense is going to take the position that what he did to save the country. What he did in terms of the quasi-war with France was the more careful policy. John Adams, you might argue, could have had an officially declared war with France. After the XYZ affair, many Americans were angry with France. You might recall millions for defense, but not one penny in tribute was a rally cry. So John Adams, the argument that the defense is going to make, was actually more cautious in his approach by not seeking to have an officially declared war. In terms of the Alien Act, you're going to argue that Citizen Genet is a good example of a dangerous immigrant who was trying to corrupt America's political process. And John Adams was just trying to protect America from the corrupting influence of new immigrants. In terms of the Sedition Act, the argument is that speech is not absolute. That, yes, John Adams was limiting speech, but this speech was providing a danger. In the future, the Supreme Court is going to famously rule that speech that provides a clear and present danger is not protected. So John Adams's defense attorneys are going to make those positions. Abigail Adams, as John Adams's wife, is obviously going to support him, and many of her views are going to be similar to the ones that I just articulated. Point of interest, Abigail Adams was not only the wife of the president, but she was an early feminist, and she was probably John Adams's closest political advisor, because John Adams was a very closed off person and didn't have many other advisors that he felt comfortable talking with. George Washington is very interesting in that although he was not officially a part of the Federalist Party, he really identified himself with many of the positions that the Federalists supported, including this idea of using the Elastic Clause. The Elastic Clause is something that George Washington uses when he creates the national bank. And you could argue that John Adams was essentially using the Elastic Clause in his policies. As George Washington's vice president, we would expect George Washington to support John Adams. Alexander Hamilton, again, a proponent of the Elastic Clause. Hamilton and John Adams have a very interesting history together. In a very simple way, you're going to argue that that Alexander Hamilton, as a proponent of the Elastic Clause, supports John Adams. If you do in-depth research, you're going to find that the two men had a very strained relationship. But in general, Alexander Hamilton, as the leader of the Federalist Party, is going to support John Adams's positions on these issues. If you are the prosecuting attorney, you might want to bring up how Hamilton viewed Jay's Treaty in terms of criticizing Hamilton's perspective on this. Napoleon's so interesting, right? Because what is he doing here? He's not even an American. And why is he a member of the defense? Why is he a defense witness? The argument that the defense is going to make about Napoleon is that Napoleon represents a real threat. And this real threat is justification for John Adams's actions, that John Adams was justified to get involved in this quasi-war because Napoleon obviously was a threat to America's autonomy. John Marshall, incredibly important person in terms of this trial and in terms of American history. His interpretation of the Constitution as a Federalist is going to be the same as John Adams's. I could have a whole screencast about this, and as a matter of fact, I do. The screencast that there's a link to on my website about Marbury versus Madison is something that you're going to want to watch for this trial. John Marshall is very much involved in this trial, and I'm gonna defer to that other screencast. There's almost too much to say about John Marshall. Well, John Took Me Off of the Boat is not a real person, obviously, but he represents a composite character who is a real people. And these are people who were impressed. Impressed sailors would have supported John Adams's actions because John Adams created a large navy. John Adams was trying to protect these sailors from impressment, and they would have supported him. Bill wants to sell stuff. A New England merchant is what this person represents. And again, similarly, John Adams's position supported the American Navy's ability to protect trade. Compared to Jefferson, defense witnesses and defense attorneys who instituted the Embargo Act, you could make a strong argument that John Adams's policies were more effective, and not only that, but more beneficial to New England merchants and New England sailors. This makes a lot of sense. John Adams is from New England. John Jay, famously of Jay's Treaty. I think Jay's Treaty represents that. For those who are going to argue that John Adams should have followed a more diplomatic route in trying to solve the problems that he was having with England and France during this period, Jay's Treaty shows that the diplomacy was not effective. Jay's Treaty is considered a huge failure, and I'm not going to go into depth because that's your job. Citizen Genet, as I said earlier, Citizen Genet was a French ambassador who really tried to subvert the diplomatic process and tried to go to the individual states. As a defense lawyer, you were going to try to show that Citizen Genet represented that new immigrants really were a threat. Now, prosecution, you are going to obviously look at these people differently. You're going to say that it wasn't that Genet was a real threat. It was that new immigrants generally voted for Thomas Jefferson, and that's why John Adams wanted to do what he wanted to do. So that's it for the defense witnesses. I'm trying to keep this fairly quick. Let's slide on down to the prosecution witnesses. Thomas Jefferson. Well, Thomas Jefferson is the most well-known advocate of states' rights during this time period. Of course, as is always the case with Jefferson, when he becomes president, he changes some of his rhetoric, or at least his policies seem to change. But Thomas Jefferson, as an authority of the Constitution, as a person who had to deal with these issues as president himself, is a very important witness. Types of things that you might want to talk about Jefferson with is how did he handle a similar conflict? How does Jefferson view the interpretation of the Constitution, etc. James Madison actually wrote the Constitution, and James Madison is so important to this trial because James Madison was dealing with the same exact issues that John Adams was dealing with, but James Madison went to war, and he got an official declaration of war. So James Madison, not only is the author of the Constitution, prosecution witnesses, you can ask him all sorts of questions as an authority on the Constitution. He also had the same exact issue and chose not to get involved in an undeclared war. He followed the Constitution and actually declared the war. So James Madison's a really great witness for you. James Callender, but you want to play up the idea that he went to jail for essentially criticizing the president. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment in your view, and you want to make a big point of that. Matthew Lyon was a congressman who also went to jail for what he said about the president, and this illustrates a real fear that political opposition can be punished. So you want to really paint John Adams as a guy who's politically motivated. The defense, you're going to try to paint John Adams as a guy who is motivated by protecting the country, who's motivated by his sense of what's right and wrong. But the prosecution is going to try to make the argument that John Adams was abusing his power for political purposes. So Matthew Lyon doesn't support John Adams. James Callender is writing negative things about John Adams. That's a really strong argument for the prosecution. For the defense, These guys are fun to attack because they're colorful. Again, I'm going to let you do the research on that, but you're going to find out some very interesting things about them. Well, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry represents a guy who never really trusted a strong federal government. And when you interview Patrick Henry, you can bring up his fears and how, in many people's minds, John Adams represented the fruition of these fears. That the American Revolution, they were fearful of a strong federal government. Many people never wanted this Constitution, Patrick Henry being one of them. And boy, here we are. We're less than 10 years in, and already people are being denied their freedom of speech. Aaron Burr is so fascinating, and where to put Aaron Burr. He's a prosecution witness, but in many ways, he's excellent for the defense because he represents the desire of some people for tyranny. So Aaron Burr was the most ambitious man in early America. My favorite quote, Hamilton once called him an embryonic Caesar. So he's a guy who is attempting to take control, both in the election of 1800, and then he's accused of treason, not once, but twice. And then he gets involved, of course, in the famous duel with Alexander Hamilton. So Aaron Burr is an interesting guy. From the prosecution point of view, Aaron Burr is opposed to the Federalists. He has a political view much like Jefferson and Hamilton, but there's so much more to him. Thomas Pinckney, famously, of course, of Pinckney's Treaty, you're going to want to talk about the benefits of negotiating and the benefits of diplomacy. So if the defense is going to talk about Jay's Treaty and how Jay's Treaty didn't work, well, you can talk about Pinckney's Treaty and how Pinckney's Treaty was very successful. It's a good argument to oppose that strong argument that the defense is going to make. Well, Joe drinks a lot of whiskey is a composite character too, and really, they didn't drink a lot of whiskey, these Pennsylvania farmers, although I'd imagine some did. They were in the business of selling it. And as you know, the Whiskey Rebellion was about the excess tax that was put on whiskey. And Joe drinks a lot of whiskey will be an excellent witness to prove that this new federal government is too strong and abuses its power. And boy, Joe drinks a lot of whiskey, is mad about it. He thinks about the tea tax and how the founding fathers were opposed to the tea tax, and then all of a sudden they're taxing his whiskey. So he's an excellent witness for you to prove that this federal government has gone too far. I tried to keep it brief. For the lawyers, I hope that gives you a little direction. For the witnesses, that gives you a little direction. But underline the word little. You need to go and do additional research and find out, all of the facts that go with the brief explanation that I gave you. Can't wait to see what you do with this trial, and I will leave you with that.